For as long as we've been hearing about mass murderers and serial killers, they've only ever been men. But in the years 1989 to 1990, one particular serial killer was responsible for the demise of 7 men. And she wasn't a man. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. It's a tale of bitter childhood, hatred towards men, a trigger-happy prostitute, mental illness, and solicited betrayal. This is the story of the first ever recorded female serial killer, also known as the Hooker from Hell. One theme that is always constant when it comes to these serial killer stories is their tragic history, and Aileen's is no different. She was born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan to a set of teenagers. Her mother was 14 when she married Aileen's dad, who was 18 years old at the time. They had a son during their first year of marriage and separated before she was born. Her mother, who was about 16 years old, abandoned her and her older brother and left them in the hands of her parents. Her father, on the other hand, was sent to prison for the kidnapping and rape of a 7-year-old child. He killed himself after serving 2 years of his sentence. Saying that Aileen Wuornos had an uneasy childhood would be an understatement. Yes, she was adopted by her maternal grandparents and raised as a sibling to her uncles and aunts, unaware of the tragic story in her family until she was 10 years old. It's said that her grandparents were vehement alcoholics, and her granddad was both physically and sexually abusive to Aileen. They say Aileen was sexually active by age 11, exchanging sexual favors for money in her high school, and even engaging in sexual feats with her older brother. But it doesn't stop there. By age 13, Aileen got pregnant due to rape by a friend of her grandfather. Her pregnancy led her to be placed in a home for unwed mothers, where she gave birth to a son and put him up for adoption. She dropped out of school after that. Her mother died around this time, and by age 15, Aileen's grandfather threw her out, so she started supporting herself through prostitution. And so began her life on the road. Things started to take a turn from the worse from this point on. Aileen hitchhiked to Florida and started working on the highways, where people could pick her up if they wanted a good time. She got in trouble with the law a lot of times for attempted robbery, vandalism, and illegal discharge of a firearm, having several arrests and a restraining order, which was ironically from her husband at the time, a 69-year-old man by the name of Louis Gratz Fell. They say she violently assaulted Fell from time to time, smacking him with his walking cane, which forced him to get a restraining order within weeks of their marriage. The marriage lasted 9 weeks before it was annulled. At this time, her older brother Keith died of cancer, and she got about $10,000 for his life insurance. Aileen blew it all within 2 months and resorted to crime once more. They say she tried to kill herself at age 22 by shooting herself in the stomach, making it the 6th time she tried suicide since age 14. Wuornos was sentenced to a year in prison for robbing a convenience store. She also committed other crimes like car theft, DUIs, and possession of an illegal firearm. Aileen was known to hold up her clients at gunpoint demanding money. Things supposedly started to take a turn for the better in 1988, when she met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid who became her gay lover. They say Aileen and Moore moved in together, and she started to support them through her work as a prostitute. But it was at this point that the murder started. A business can sometimes be full of complicated transactions, and there are often negotiations and bargaining, which can sometimes be tasking. Then there's the matter of payment, which occasionally demands a heavy price. But for some of the men who did business with Aileen Wuornos, they paid with their lives. Her first victim was a man called Richard Charles Mallory. He was shot many times, and they even found 2 bullets in his lungs. Wuornos claimed that Mallory had raped and sodomized her, which was why she did what she did. She abandoned his body in the woods and left his car a few miles further. Aileen killed 7 men within 12 months. One of them was retired Air Force Major, as well as a former chief of police by the name of Charles Richard Humphreys. All of her victims died from gunshot wounds, and not some form of gruesome dismemberment. Aileen, in her later confessions, seemed to view this as some sort of comfort, that even though she'd killed a lot of people, she was rather clean about it. She said that they described her like she'd committed the worst crimes in the world, and it just didn't seem that way to her. Aileen murdered these men and would drive off with their cars and then repeat the act sometime later. They say she even sold some of their belongings to pawn shops, which eventually led to her arrest. It happened in a biker bar in Florida. 2 undercover cops bought Wuornos a drink and led her to the back of the bar, where she was met with 6 armed police officers. They discovered Aileen was the culprit due to the fingerprint she left on one of the vehicles she stole from her victims. She and Tyria Moore were seen by an eyewitness after they crashed the car, and and this prompted the search for them. Seeing that she'd been arrested several times, her prints were already in the system, and the prints matched the prints the police found on the belongings from the pawn shops, so it was a solid lead. And so they arrested Wuornos and took her in. They also arrested Moore in Pennsylvania, and she outright sold out Aileen. They say Moore made countless calls to Wuornos and urged her to confess to the murders, which she eventually did. Wuornos stated that the men she had killed had tried to rape her, so she acted in self-defense. Wuornos was rather pompous in a lot of her interviews, and even in court, she claimed that she didn't see herself as a serial killer, that she was just defending herself. She noted that her murders were too spread out, and if she'd had the intention to kill, she would have killed more men. In 1992, she went to trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. Her defense did its best to make her case of rape seem authentic, as Mallory had a history of such acts in his lifetime. The court refused to take that evidence into account, and 4 days later, Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death. A psych evaluation showed that Aileen Wuornos was not very mentally stable. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, as well as antisocial personality disorder. She pled no contest to her other trials, and she subsequently received 6 death sentences. The sad thing is, Aileen Wuornos was happy with this outcome. She was relieved by the prospect of her own demise. She claimed that everyone she loved had betrayed her, so she wanted to leave this cruel world. She was legally adopted by Arlene Prowl during the whole ordeal. Arlene was a Christian woman who stated that the Holy Spirit had urged her to adopt Aileen and lead her to God. It must have worked, because Aileen claimed that one of the reasons she came clean about all the crimes she had committed was because she wanted to get right with God. And the reason she was so happy about her death sentence was that she believed that when she died, she would be going to heaven. Her adopted mother, Arlene, said she wanted to help Aileen feel the warmth of a loving family, and she tried to convince Wuornos to plea for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. That way she could still be of service to humanity. But Wuornos insisted that she wanted to die. Wuornos was incarcerated in Florida State Prison for up to a decade. She remained on death row even as her counsel tried to file for an appeal. She was adamant in dismissing every appeal, claiming that she did what she did and that she would do it again. Wuornos wrote a series of disturbing statements, saying that she had hate inside of her. Her exact words were, "I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." She cited that her prison patrons were subjecting her to harsh treatment and torture, and they were directing pure hatred toward her. During her time in prison, she was interviewed by movie producers who turned her story into documentaries and movies. She hated the way her story was portrayed, and she hated the way she'd been treated by society. Aileen Wuornos met her end by a lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her last words were, "I'll be back," citing that she will one day return with Jesus. Aileen's story is one of childhood trauma and severe misfortune throughout life. Her story has been told and retold over the years. Until this day, she remains history's first ever recorded female serial killer. And perhaps she's as much of a victim as she is a murderer. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe for more.